Okay, so Bitcoin right now is getting a lot of attention. Right now the price is 55,000, actually a little bit higher, 55,000 and around 700. But a lot of people are buying into it, not really knowing what it does. And the way I see Bitcoin is it's nothing but a speculation yet. See, a lot of people think that it can replace the dollar as maybe the reserve currency. But it's just not there yet because it's really not competing against the dollar. Exchange, when you're buying goods or services, nobody uses Bitcoin because, well, one reason is because not enough people use Bitcoin and have Bitcoin to exchange in the first place. And the second reason is just because it's way too volatile. And, it went up from over 30,000, but under 40,000 to 55,000 very, very quickly. And it could drop back very quickly. And so, I mean, and also there just isn't enough confidence in Bitcoin. And most people aren't willing to accept Bitcoin because, they just don't really have anything to do with it. And they don't trust the asset enough to store their value. And I think rightfully so because Bitcoin really stores no value. The cryptocurrency asset itself has no value. Now, that's not to say that the US dollar or any other fiat currency has value. They both really have no value because there's not much you can do with them. Now, I'm not talking about like physical paper and coins. I mean, that you could actually technically do something with it. Now, $100 bill is just a piece of paper and it's not really worth, the bill itself is not worth anything close to what you could buy with $100. But, most, you could call currency, most money is just credit. It's just bank deposits, just switching from one person's bank account to another. But let's not get into that right now because I want to talk a little bit more about Bitcoin. And so, Bitcoin right now, I mean, Tesla's buying it. Apparently Elon Musk thinks that people will exchange their Bitcoin for cars. But people are buying into Bitcoin not really as a store of value, especially now. Before Bitcoin's kind of increased to really 40,000, it was highly correlated with gold. And that's not to say it has the same properties or the same value as gold does, but it was just highly correlated with gold. But after it kind of just broke off, interest rates started to rise, but Bitcoin rose even faster. So just right then, it kind of just moved away from its classical purpose. But more importantly, the misconception that Bitcoin is a store of value is just entirely flawed because it has no value to store. Because when you're buying a stock or a commodity, what you're buying is the underlying asset. If you're buying a share of Tesla, for example, you actually have a chunk of the company. Now you also have a chunk of Bitcoin because the company owns some Bitcoin, but you also have a chunk of the company itself. But when you're buying Bitcoin, I guess you're buying a percentage of the total amount of Bitcoin in existence, which is limited to 21 million Bitcoin. But and to this day, we don't think that it's going to increase. The quantity of Bitcoin. We don't think it's going to increase, and that might be right. But even if it doesn't increase, that doesn't mean it has any value. And its value, well, it doesn't have any, but its purpose as a form of currency entirely depends on trust. Now, it's more so distrust in central banks. You see, fiat currency has money because, or has value. Well, not value, but it has a purpose, and it can be used as currency because people have trust in the government. People have trust that the governments won't go crazy with inflationary policies and just won't just completely devalue their currencies. And so people find it as some sort of relatively safe asset, and they perform exchange with it. And Bitcoin, that could end up happening. It's a possibility. But right now, the people in the market, markets buying Bitcoin, the sentiment is not anywhere close to, I'm going to buy Bitcoin because it's I find it safer than dollars or yen or euros. But they're just buying Bitcoin because they think it's going to go higher and they think it's going to make them money. And of course, saying people are saying, Bitcoin to 100K, and they're saying, Bitcoin to 1 million or to 150K or whatever number it is. But they're not saying that because necessarily they think that, the dollar is going to lose half of its value, causing Bitcoin to go to 100K. But because really, if the dollar loses half of its value, based on fundamentals, that shouldn't do anything to Bitcoin. Because just because the dollar got, 50% weaker, I mean, that doesn't matter because Bitcoin, you're just buying a pretty much something equivalent to air. You're buying a claim on a pretty much non-existent asset that is somewhere present on your computers. And so Bitcoin cannot be used as a medium of exchange yet. And the reason for that is it doesn't have enough trust. And even if it were to compete eventually, let's say everybody started to think that the government was going to create too much inflation through, I guess, fiscal policies, where, if the monetary system just lets out all of the inflation from that is pretty well contained in assets, if they let it out into the real economy, eventually, people might start looking into inflation hedges like precious metals or, now Bitcoin. Now, the real fundamental of Bitcoin, it has nothing to do with, being an inflation hedge, because there's nothing about it that hedges against inflation other than, limited quantity. But a limited quantity of something that has no value, it doesn't matter. There could be one Bitcoin, but there's nothing better about Bitcoin than any other cryptocurrency that has, that has a limited quantity. Other than the fact that, maybe it's the first and that it is more established than other cryptocurrencies, but that doesn't give it value. I mean, there's really nothing about that makes Bitcoin usable in any way. Because if you're buying a computer, I mean, there's a ton of stuff you could do with your computer. One of the things, but one of the more meaningless things, is mining Bitcoin. But I mean, other than that, you could watch videos, you could surf the internet, you could listen to this podcast, which you should do. But Bitcoin, it's just a number on your computer. there's no, you can't do anything with it. And so it can't store value, and people just use it as speculation and hope to get rich. And pretty much everybody does that. And, to some extent, you could call it a pyramid scheme, but it's more so a speculation. Then, of course, pretty much everybody who owns Bitcoin tries to pump it up. Now, I'm not saying that Bitcoin cannot work, because it can, but it's a very risky long-term investment. You know what? Speculation is probably a better word than investment, because there are so many risks involved in Bitcoin, especially in the long term. And many of the risks come from it has no value. Many of the risks come from your trying to compete against governments worldwide. The government of India just banned pretty much all cryptocurrencies. And right now, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies aren't even competing against fiat currencies, right? No one's using them to buy houses. No one's using them to, actually buy stuff at the grocery store. I mean, no one yet is using them to buy cars, really. I mean, maybe in the future, but it's not even competing against fiat currency, and the government of India is already banning it. If Bitcoin becomes a competitor of the US dollar, I mean, there's no reason why the US government wouldn't ban it. Like the US government banned gold in the 1930s. It's not something that's out of the government's control. And, it's possible that if the day comes, if we eventually get a lot of inflation, maybe the U.S. government is going to ban gold too. That's possible. But Bitcoin is a much easier target because it's done online. Now, I guess it's not as trackable because I'm not too familiar with the technology, and so can't go too much into that. But still, it should not be very difficult to crack down on everyone who's transacting in Bitcoin. For a government to do that, it shouldn't be that difficult. And how I really see Bitcoin is not so much an investment, but I see it more as a speculation. Now, the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it's highly correlated to gold. Now, like I've mentioned, it kind of broke off the correlation, like a few months ago, but it's still relatively highly correlated to precious metals. And you could speculate in Bitcoin as an alternative to precious metals if you believe that precious metals will do well. But then I don't see why you would, why you wouldn't just go in and buy precious metals. But nevertheless, Bitcoin as a speculation can offer you much higher returns, but you also have to realize that it carries far greater risk. And obviously, it carries way more volatility than probably anything. I mean, I don't even know if, well, I guess maybe compared to other cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin doesn't it doesn't carry so much volatility. But I mean, volatility when you're speculating isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so as a speculation, I certainly see how Bitcoin could work. But the problem is, it's once you begin to really believe that Bitcoin is something that you're deeply invested in for its value, and something that you believe will perform very well long term, and or something that you believe will challenge, compete against, or even replace global fiat currencies. that is, the probability of that happening is incredibly low. Now, the market cap of Bitcoin, I think it just passed $1 trillion. And if you compare that to the market cap of the amount of fiat currencies around the world, I mean, that's just a trillion's just a rounding error at that point. And so, as of today, it's really not a fair competition against any type of currency. But if you believe that it is a good long-term speculation, what you really have to be careful of is, okay, well, will you really be invested in it for a long time? And I'll give you a perfect investment not analogy, but example. So, I mean, imagine if you're holding Bitcoin at $10. Bitcoin at $10 has no more value than it does today, other than the fact that a lot more people think that it has value, maybe, and that a lot of people think that it's going to go up. And so it's more established, but the physical the intrinsic value of Bitcoin hasn't changed. It's only that more people know about it and more people think that, it's a better replacement. But what it actually is hasn't changed. And so if you are an early holder of Bitcoin from, $10 to $100, most people would have sold their Bitcoin, right? You just made a tenfold gain on a random cryptocurrency that you just bought into. Same with Dogecoin. Imagine if you're buying Dogecoin today. I don't know what it's trading at, maybe 6 cents or something. But if it goes from 6 cents to $1, I mean, everyone's going to sell. I mean, no one's going to hold Dogecoin thinking that, it's going to go to 50,000. But the exact same thing happened to Bitcoin. Now, there are fundamental differences between Dogecoin and Bitcoin, but they're not completely different. And there are probably a lot of cryptocurrencies that mimic Bitcoin. They have this pretty much the same fundamental values as Bitcoin do. Not values, which is, the characteristics. But, if you're holding Bitcoin at $10, there's a incredibly high likelihood that you would have sold at 100. And there's really, I mean, if it goes to 1,000 from 10, would you not sell? You just made 100 times profit. And you never knew that it would go to 55,000. And so that's the problem. You don't know when it's good to go in, and you don't know when it's good to go out. So treat it as a speculation that has correlation with precious metals, but not necessarily as a good long-term investment. And definitely not digital gold.